Hello there, my name is Hannah Maswani, and I am the Director of Mission and Equity Consulting at the YWCA McLean County. If you're even slightly familiar with the YW, you know that our mission is to eliminate racism and to empower women. And so that's why for this week's Think About It Thursday, I wanted to dive into the nitty-gritty of SB8, or the Texas abortion ban. This bill, affectionately known as the Texas Heartbeat Act, is one of the most insidious and craftily written pieces of legislature that specifically, exclusively attacks women, our bodies, and our right to choose. When this was put forth on September 1st, the first thing that folks noticed is that it prohibits abortions where any fetal cardiac activity is detected. A deliberately specific yet kind of ambiguous phrase, right? Here we see a weaponization of timing because embryonic or fetal cardiac activity can be detected as early as 6 weeks typically, though because not all bodies are the same, it might be detected as early as 4 or 5 weeks. I want to emphasize for anybody who is watching this who's never been pregnant, who's not really sure how all that works, 6 weeks is typically only 2 weeks after a woman can take a pregnancy test, right? Because for anyone who's been pregnant, you know that you kind of have to miss a period to figure out, okay, maybe I'm pregnant now, right? 85 to 90% of abortions are performed after the 6-week mark. Why? Because women typically, we don't know if we're pregnant until after the 6-week mark. But this bill prohibits that. What that does is effectively invalidate Roe v. Wade. So you're probably familiar, Roe v. Wade was the Supreme Court decision in 1973 that allowed women to safely and legally get abortions up until 24 weeks. That is 4 times longer than SB8 allows. This is a precedent case that has been challenged in various different ways throughout different states, including in Texas. Mark Crutcher of Spies for Life, who incentivized and paid individuals publicizing a manual to allow them to sort of snoop on doctors, see where folks might be getting abortions. It's kind of like this, but legal. So this is not just one pro-life activist movement. This is the entire state taking a pro-life stance because, again, 6 weeks is pretty unrealistic. I want to emphasize that Section 2 states problematically that the state of Texas never repealed, either expressly or by implication, the statutes enacted before the ruling in Roe v. Wade. So a bit confusingly written, but in lay people's terms, because I've spent a lot of time diving into this horrendous document, Texas effectively, though it says it will not punish women who had abortions before September 1st, it is effectively stating in this legislation, yeah, I don't know Roe v. Wade. I don't see it. I don't accept it. In this document as well, there is a weaponization of a prioritization of legal opinion over medicine. The word legislator and the word Texas is mentioned countless times more than doctor, medicine, health, or well-being. In fact, in Section 171, it quotes, Texas has compelling interests from the outset of a woman's pregnancy in protecting the health of the woman and the life of the unborn child. Texas's interests are literally on the page and in the legislation placed before the interests or the well-being of the woman or the child. Also throughout the document, the word fetus and embryo is crossed out to change it to unborn child. Again, humanizing literally a zygote. Getting back to high school science there. A zygote, again, is the moment of conception. It is when 2 cells fuse together. That's not yet a baby, but according to this legislature, yeah, it is. What makes this bill different? No exceptions are made for survivors of rape or incest. Furthermore, it does not state that pregnancy begins at conception, as you might think. No. Pregnancy doesn't happen at the start of intercourse. It doesn't happen because of intercourse. According to this bill, one counts the 6 weeks of pregnancy from the last date of the woman's last period. What that means is if a woman has intercourse and becomes pregnant 3 weeks after her last period, those 3 weeks where she was not pregnant are still counted against her in the 6 weeks of the 6-week ban. Furthermore, problematically as well, is that this law is not enforced by the police, it's not enforced by the courts. It is encouraged and literally financially incentivized for private citizens to take this to civil courts. It's always dangerous when we empower citizens to legally fight and sue each other. Because this law is enforced exclusively through private civil enforcement actions, that gives everyone an interest, but a right to have an opinion, have a legal opinion, and have a financially viable legal opinion against any woman's choice of what to do with her body. Effectively, this lies on incentivize snitching. So it relies on snitching tactics. It relies on offering $10,000 bonuses or bounties, if you will, for correctly identifying a woman who may or may not be seeking an abortion after 6 weeks. It's deeply reminiscent of the Nazis' tactics used to out anybody who did not fit their anti-Semitic white Aryan regime, right? What this also does, more sort of with the ethos of what it is to be a woman, it creates a culture of mistrust and stigma and shame around women's healthcare needs. So I mentioned this law goes right after women. It is specifically about women. It is specifically against women and their right to choose. But it's not only women who are going to be dragged through the mud in court. This law gives permission for independent citizens to sue anyone, and right there in the bottom 3 lines, regardless of whether the person knew or should have known that the abortion would be performed or induced in violation of this chapter. So what does that mean? Let's say I give my friend a ride to her annual pap smear or her women's wellness. I could be sued. Let's say I'm the receptionist who answers the phone. I could be sued. Maybe you're the Uber driver. Maybe you're the person on the other line of the insurance company. You can be sued under this act. I want to emphasize that this is not just a version of the Handmaid's Tale, because we can't whitewash this. We have to call this out for what it is. This is an opportunity and an encouragement of racist, xenophobic tactics. This is part of a long-standing legacy in which Black women's bodies have been used as tools, as cadavers, as lab rats for white interest. I want to give a not so great shout out here to Dr. James Marion Sims, known as the father of gynecology, who performed vicious, violent experiments on Black enslaved women without any anesthetics. I also want to give a really not great shout out to the forced sterilizations that have been happening in the United States for the last 2 centuries. Forced sterilizations, particularly of Black, Indigenous, and Latina women. So much so that we know of 60,000 that have occurred since 1909. Again, these are only the ones we know about. And so much so that the 20,000 forced sterilizations, again, forced or coerced sterilizations of Latina women that happened in the early 1900s inspired the Nazis in their eugenics movement. I don't know about y'all, but if the laws of my country inspired Nazis, we might have a little bit to work on, right? So we talked about the women who can be accused here, right? What does this mean? Like, how might I be accused? Well, I want to emphasize that accusers need literally no evidence to make an accusation. I might have beef with my neighbor. Maybe they didn't pick up their dog poo on my yard. I could accuse her. It is up to the accused woman to find the preponderance of evidence to defend herself. I also want to emphasize from a socioeconomic standing that let's say I accuse somebody who doesn't have that much money, right? The court is under no legal obligation to tell the accused woman that her court date was moved location hundreds of miles away, that they changed the court date. And I also want to emphasize, especially for accused women of lower income status, that the accuser can sue the woman they accused up to 3 years after the initial accusation. So let's say I accuse my neighbor. I still don't like her 2.5 years later. You know what? That fancy prosecutor that I hired, those court fees, all those legal fees that I incurred because I accused her, well, I'm going to make her pay those back, even if the case was unsuccessful. Effectively, it's rewarding me dragging her through the mud because I don't like her. Maybe I'm a racist. Maybe we have some beef. Maybe it's my ex. The legislature doesn't care. Texas doesn't care. It wants to prosecute. Because of this nature of not needing any evidence to make an accusation, this effectively puts a target on women from underserved communities. The blurring of the lines between civil and criminal court is not healthy for anyone from a minoritized background. So racists are free to target all Black and Latino women, all brown women, because they feel like it. They don't need evidence. They can still sue her for all of her money and ruin her financially. Let's say someone suspects a woman of being undocumented, but they don't know how to go through all the rigmarole of calling ICE. I'll just say she was pregnant. Then that undocumented woman will have to go through the courts. And even if they are found innocent of not, having the right to choose and not terminating a pregnancy 6 weeks and a day after they became pregnant or after their last period, well, the courts don't care because that undocumented woman is now in the criminal court system and can be deported. Accusers are legally allowed to sue defendants under highly problematic definitions of financial burden as well. Being lower income is not enough of an excuse. Working paycheck to paycheck is not enough of an excuse to say, hey, I can't afford to give my accuser $10,000, because the courts will say, well, how do we know you're not going to use that money for another abortion? So you can financially, socially, politically ruin a woman through this without any need for evidence. So I ask, where does this stop? This is turning into a quite literal witch hunt, can't even say the word, but a witch hunt that allows people to sue anyone who does something that they deem unfavorable without any evidence. And for anyone who's watching who's pro-life, I want to emphasize that this bill is not about protecting unborn children. It is literally, there's more language in SB8 about protecting itself than there is about protecting any fetuses, any zygotes, any embryos, right? Throughout the document, countless times it states that it is the intent of the legislature that every provision, section, subsection, sentence, clause, phrase, or word in this chapter and every application thereof are severable from each other. What that means in lay folks' terms is that if any part of this bill is deemed unconstitutional, Texas doesn't care. They're still going to enact all the rest of the words there. So what it does is pretty much disregard a woman's constitutional rights based off of the desires or the interests of the men, again, men who wrote this legislation. I also need to address the fact that there are a lot of misconception around Planned Parenthood. Only 3% of all the services that Planned Parenthood across America annually offer are abortion, or in the realm of terminating pregnancies, right? Again, that's 3%. So 97% of what Planned Parenthood does is pap smears, women's wellness tests, STD prevention. It's not abortion. However, under SB8, let's say I see my old friend who I don't like no more. I see her going to Planned Parenthood for her annual wellness visit. Oops, looks like I can accuse her. So what this does is it allows me to sue anyone that I want to, again, without any proof of evidence. Furthermore, as I mentioned, it's right-wing bounty hunting because accusers will be awarded up to $10,000 of the accused woman's money simply for making the accusation, if they are indeed found out to be correct, which, again, the preponderance of evidence is on the accused, and there aren't any parameters around this, really. There's a weaponization of freedoms here that is at the expense of queer women, Black women, women of color, students, teachers, and even healthcare workers, who we know throughout COVID and the high rates of COVID in Texas are overworked. The legal system also in Texas isn't prepared to take on this number of cases. Systemically, it is disadvantageous to Texans of all ethnicities, all races, all genders that this goes through, yet it still went through. This is part of a larger picture of vigilante racism that's happening in Texas, where teachers are being paid to snitch on their peers if they bring up gender fluidity, sexuality, discussions of race, or accurate history in their classrooms. Let me repeat that for you. Through targeted emails and Facebook groups, teachers are encouraged and students are encouraged to rat out their teachers if they discuss things like race. This is another tool in that arsenal that empowers private citizens and financially rewards private citizens for this. I need to mention, because I did talk about the forced sterilization of women of color. You might think, well, this bill is like forcing women to have babies. Surely that makes up for it. Not so much. There's been a lot of rhetoric around the majority-minority myth, which is in 2045, the census data predicts that white people will be a smaller population than all other groups of color. First of all, that's problematic and reductive because all groups of color, we're not all the same, right? But this has created some fear-mongering that networks like Fox News have picked up to be like, oh no, white people are the minority now. So this bill is forcing white women, victims of rape and incest, to carry to term their children, their embryos, so that the white population can remain large. Women are being used as pawns. I mean, I've said don't just compare it to The Handmaid's Tale, but it's kind of like that. I want to encourage that this work continues because things like SB8, again, were part of feminist dystopia that we thought couldn't happen. We tend to view America as being very progressive, a great place for women's rights, but a lot of this rhetoric is what we demonize in other communities as being primitive, as being sexist. But We sort of let it happen here, even though it's an indication of a larger fascist regime, against women. I also want to state, because I've neglected to mention earlier, that there are so few abortion clinics or so few medical offices that can legally and safely provide abortions in Texas that 6 weeks is literally not enough time to know that you're pregnant, let alone travel upwards of 150 miles, get in front of a doctor twice, do the 24-hour waiting period after you see the ultrasound. There are so many ways that this puts impossible hurdles for women to choose the right to have the relationship with their body that they want to have. However, it's not all doom and gloom, although the majority of it is. I want to give a shout out to Illinois for pushing forward the Democrat-sponsored Texas Act, which flips the script. So SB8 is primarily about punishing, attacking, and accusing women. It's persecuting women for their own ability to reproduce. It's forcing women into reproduction. It's treating us a bit like chattel. This law, however, in Illinois, flips the script and only accuses men. What it does is it says, if you were a man, whether you are a rapist or someone who did not use protection and unknowingly, or rather knowingly, got your girlfriend pregnant when she didn't want to be, she told you to use protection, you didn't, the woman can now sue the man. There's been a lot of rhetoric around this about how it's sexist, that it only goes for men. If you're in that crowd and you thought that too, I challenge you to think about SB8 from the alternative lens, where it specifically, exclusively goes against women. Now, I'm not saying that we need to go tit for tat in terms of how we prosecute. However, we need to think about the preponderance of legislation that is passed where it's all about men's opinions on women's bodies. We need to protect each other from these abuses of powers, because historically we have weaponized legislation against women, against folks of color, to abuse women and to abuse people of color. I want to encourage you to learn more about this. I will share a number of resources that I encourage you to pause and read through, because I'm sure you'll want to fact check me, and I deeply encourage you to do so. If you're looking for a depressing read, I've provided the link to the entire legislation. But I want you to know that there are ways that you can stand up against this. You can exercise compassion. And speaking of compassion, I urge you to think about the facts around this and not just the feelings. So if you've made it this far into the video and you are pro-life, I want you to think about what it means that a stranger somewhere in a courtroom can put his interest, or the quote unquote state's interest, above your own well-being. I want you to think about the fact that it's 6 weeks into a pregnancy. Again, 85 to 90% of women don't know they're pregnant at that point. It's 6 weeks into a pregnancy that your opinion no longer legally matters. I want you to think about the facts of this and not just the feelings. As I've shared, these are the different sources that I've used. I encourage you to pause, check them out, fact check me. Please feel free to respond in the comments. Again, I've listed the second one there is the entire document of SB8. I encourage you to think about the Texas Heartbeat Act, cutely named, as another opportunity for a state to punish women. So much so that the people who have drafted this legislation are currently seeking to go after the criminalization of all forms of gay sex and legal marriage. We're part of a fascist regime if we don't stop this. Please reach out if you have any questions whatsoever. I've been Hannah Maswani, and this has been this week's Think About It Thursday on SB8, also known as the Texas